And it's working. Once again, I apologize for our squirrels on the roof doing air conditioning work. It is simply part of the joy of being in Florida. We get lovely, lovely mild winters, but we also are desperate to make sure the AC continues to work when summer starts rolling around. So we just have to put up with that. Now, if you've also been following the news, you've also seen that Israel is putting up with even worse temperatures than we're putting up with. They are expecting a ferocious heat wave right now, which is not a good time at Lag BaOmer. With the bonfires that go on around the country, it can cause real horrible damage. Let's hope that they have a safe celebration of Lag BaOmer. And I think they said the temperatures are going to be getting well over 100 during this time, which it's no fun. But the land of Israel is still beautiful. It is still wonderful. It is still our inheritance. And in fact, in Behar, this parasha, we're going to talk a little bit about how we take care of that beautiful, lovely inheritance that we've been given. That is to say, how we take care of the land of Israel. We've talked before about how we take care of the other people in the land of Israel, but now we're looking at the land itself. Now, what is the primary way that we take care of the land on a regular basis, according to the Torah?
Agriculture.
Okay, agriculture, good, but there's a specific mitzvah that is connected to our agricultural cycle.
The land gets a rest every 7 years.
The sabbatical years, right? Shemitah, 7 years, right? Every 7 years, right? We have one off. It's the weekend of the land, if you will. It's the land's Shabbat, which is indeed where the word sabbatical comes from. Is for the Sabbath that's given to the land. But that's not the only version, because we get that.
Times 7
is
Jubilee.
the Jubilee. Right? And every 49 cycles, we end up getting
an extra year.
Exactly. We get the one that we would normally be expecting for being the end of a 7-year cycle, and then we get another one on top of that. But this has a process that, this has a side effect that is more pronounced than you might think. So in addition to the land getting rest and the land allowing itself to rejuvenate and not be overworked by following this process, there is also a major event that happens vis-a-vis land ownership.
Yeah.
At the 49, at the Jubilee mark, which is?
It reverses back to original owner.
The general term that's used is the release, right? The release of the land. That if I sold you my farm, and that farm was part of my family's inheritance, then when the Jubilee year comes along, I get my farm back.
In our current legal system, those are known as reversionary interests. So
sure.
That's how.
There is something like that.
Absolutely, it's called
in American law, a reversionary interest. Great, but we're going to call it release or the Jubilee release. This happens also for indentured servants, but we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the land today. And to understand this, we have to sort of get into the mindset of we enter the land during the time of Joshua. The land is allocated by tribe, but then within each tribal allocation, there is also further division per family. So that those families who were there at the beginning of the conquest, they are given a chunk of land, and that is their portion. That is their inheritance. That is their lot for all time. And a person can become alienated from it, meaning that they can fall upon hard times and they have to sell it or even their own labor in order to make ends meet. But it will never permanently become alienated from them. It will never be permanently taken away from them. And that's what we're going to be focusing on and why that might be the case. And as well as what we in the modern world can do with this, since we do not live according to this structure, because no one of us actually has a personal claim to a plot of land in Israel that is going all the way back to the allocation of Joshua. Even if somebody here owns land in Israel, you're not owning it according to this rule. We good? Okay, with that in mind, page 740. And we are going to begin on Leviticus 25, and it is verse 13 for our reading. Volunteer?
In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his holding. When you sell property to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling to you, he shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. The more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price. For what he is selling you is a number of harvests. Do not wrong one another, but fear your God, for I, the Lord, am your God.
Okay, so let's make sure we understand what God is trying to explain here in the divine economy, which is to say, if I'm buying your farm from you, or a piece of your farm, which was more likely to be sold piecemeal, plot by plot, when we're negotiating the price, we can look at this and say, this plot of land will, on average, produce a yield that is worth 100 shekels. Right? We're just taking a random number. Don't think that this is indicative of the actual biblical economy. So let's say we're expecting about 100 shekels a year of return from the produce of this piece of land. Well, that's great. But if I'm buying it from you as opposed to renting it from you year after year, then how do I figure out what a fair price is? Well, you could just say, well, it's worth 100 shekels. You're going to be getting this forever. I want 100,000 shekels because you're going to be earning a whole bunch of money off of this land. The problem, says God, is no, that would be exploitative because they're never technically going to get it forever. They're instead only going to get it until the next release at the next Jubilee. And so what you do is you work out. It's worth 100 shekels. There are 10 years left between now and the next Jubilee. That means that a reasonable person would expect about 1,000 shekels worth of value to be produced by this land under the coming years before the release returns it to the original owner. Now we negotiate how much it's worth to you based on the estimation of about 1,000 shekels worth of produce. Does that make sense? That doesn't mean you have to pay 1,000 shekels for it because, hey, I still got to do work for this and you may be more desperate and want to, but I can't manipulate the negotiation excessively. We both have to start with this as our starting point before we do anything else for the negotiation. Make sense? Okay. Be fair is the shorthand. Onward.
You shall observe my laws and faithfully keep my rules, that you may live upon the land in security. The land shall yield its fruit, and you shall eat your fill, and you shall live upon it in security. And should you ask, what are we to eat in the 7th year, if we may neither sow nor gather in our crops?
Which is a pretty reasonable question, right? God is saying, don't worry, you follow my rules, everything's going to be fine. And you're sitting there going, but wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I don't eat. It's going to be a secure 6 years, and then I starve to death. This sounds a bit odd. So God explains.
I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will still be eating old grain of that crop. You will be eating the old until the 9th year, until its crops come in.
All right. Does everyone understand how the agriculture works? Because God needs to do more for us in the 6th year than just cover the 7th year, because we can't do anything in the 7th year, which means we don't start planting until the beginning of the 8th year, which means we have to wait until its harvest starts coming in for us to begin to eat again. So there is a special bounty that's needed in order to last us through that entire dry spell of the 7th year where no agricultural process is happening. Does that make sense? Because this is not like we just stop buying for a year. This is we stop growing, and growing takes time. And we have to restart that growing process when the 8th year begins. Everyone follow that? Good. I know we're not farmers, but hopefully we can figure that much out. Verse 23.
But the land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. throughout the land that you hold, you must provide for the redemption of the land.
Okay, what do you mean provide for the redemption of the land? What does that mean?
Redemption means redeem.
Correct? And what does that mean functionally? What's the policy that comes from this commandment?
You have to have a process for it.
This,
Oh, release.
the release, right? The redemption of the land means that the land is returned to the original owners, right? So when God is saying don't sell it permanently, he's saying if you sold it permanently, you would be violating this command that allows for the land to be redeemed. Now, redeemed also has a secondary meaning, which is not to do with the release, but to do with a premature release. Now, remember I said that a lot of people would sell their land because they were in dire circumstances. Well, if they do, they have the opportunity to buy it back and redeem the land should they come to better situations. So let's imagine, Frank runs out of money. He has to sell, 5 acres of his farm and, just use that money to restart his business, and he hopes for the best. And after another 2 years, he's actually done really, really well. And he has enough money that he can buy back those acres from the guy he sold it to. The guy he sold it to has to allow him to buy it back
At the same price?
at the fair price of what is left, prorated based on the usage of the land and how many years are left to the release and all of that.
You only have 1 year to buy it back, though, right?
It's ish. Right? So there is a window, but you're supposed to be willing to allow a person to redeem their primary inheritance as well. Now, property within a city was different. Right? Property within a city, there was a walled city. There was a much narrower window for the return of that property, because that was not part of the allocated holding from the time of Joshua. Yeah.
So the person that bought the land, when he had to, if I had enough money to buy my land back,
Right.
they can't they don't make a profit. They can't charge me interest and nothing like that.
Definitely no interest, right? Because it wasn't considered a loan. It was considered to be a transaction. But in fact, if we look at page 742, this was just meant to be a bit of a warm up to this. Let's read that first paragraph.
If your kinsman is in straits and has to sell part of his holding, his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his kinsman has sold. If a man has no one to redeem for him, but prospers and acquires enough to redeem with, he shall compute the years since its sale, refund the difference to the man to whom he sold it, and return to his holding. If he lacks sufficient means to recover it, what he sold shall remain with the purchaser until the Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, it shall be released, and he shall return to his holding.
Okay, so hopefully that takes care of some of the different contingents we just saw. And the next paragraph goes on to discuss what the difference is between that and a walled city.
So
But
that means in the Jubilee year, no money is exchanged?
correct, it returns automatically. You do not buy it back at the Jubilee year. It comes back to you. But again, it's not a gift because the person already paid for it, and they only paid enough to cover the time until the Jubilee. That's why God,
A lease.
well, in the modern American terms, we would consider this to be a lease. It's not the term that's used in the Hebrew because it does use the term sell, but the sale price is predicated on the idea that the land permanently belongs to the original owners, and that the price is variable depending upon how many years between now and the Jubilee release the new owner will be able to use it.
This only applies to the land in Israel, right? If anything
Yes.
about-
That's right. This is only talking about the land of Israel, and it's only talking about the land of Israel as it was allocated during the times of Joshua. So, for example, this is not modern Israeli land law.
In the book of Ruth, which we'll be reading coming up, is this part of what's going on with the?
Not exactly. That the redemption in the book of Ruth is actually the redemption more of what we call yibum, of the Levirate marriage.
Okay.
The idea, however, is that whoever redeems her and provides an heir, that child will then also be inheriting the land from her original husband,
Okay.
and that would be become the child's official holding, the child's property. Okay, so why are we doing this? Let's go ahead and take a look in Guide for Perplexed, Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, as to the precepts, which is where we are on the front page.
As to the precepts enumerated in the laws concerning the year of release and the Jubilee, some of them imply sympathy with our fellow men and promote the well-being of mankind. For in reference to these precepts, it is stated in the law that the poor of your people may eat. And besides, the land will also increase its produce and improve when it remains fallow for some time.
All right, so Rambam, in his typical rational capacity, while absolutely acknowledging that even if we don't have an understanding of the mitzvot, we still do them, still tries to give us an understanding of the mitzvot. And he's already given us two very good reasons of why we're doing this. One, it's compassion. Right? When God's talking about how we handle our land and how we deal with this, there is an inculcation, a training for a human to understand compassion and to understand the well-being of each other. Right? So there is compassion, there is human well-being, and there is also what we would call productivity. The land works better when you don't work the land. That's an important part of maintaining the productivity of the land. We all good so far? Good. Rambam's nice, clear, rational. Onward.
Other precepts of this class prescribe kindness to servants and to the poor by renouncing all claims to debts and relieving the slaves of their bondage.
Right, so God is also giving us the lesson about kindness through these bundle of commandments. Onward.
There are some precepts in this class that serve to secure for the people a permanent source of maintenance and support by providing that the land should remain the permanent property of its owners and that it could not be sold. As it says, and the land shall not be sold forever. In this way, the property of a person remains intact for him and his heirs, and he can only enjoy the produce thereof.
Okay, so that would give us as a fifth principle that is being taught by this kind of these commandments. Well, wait, what principle would we call that? We got compassion. We have good for people. We have good for the land. We have kindness that's being done for people. What principle are we learning of people should never be permanently alienated from their land?
It's justice.
Is it justice?
To have an equitable distribution of an equitable access to means of support. Everybody has access to their own little plot of land. That way you're relieving the burden on everybody else of, can you give me some food?
Okay, so
Yes, so there's the justice in that.
but isn't that the kindness and the compassion element?
I see it's very practical.
It is practical, which is why I think justice is not a bad idea, but it's a different layer of justice than we're used to. I think the word that he's focusing on here that we sort of slip through, and the one that God himself uses, is security. Right? That a person should feel secure, that they should feel they have a right by God to know that no matter how much their life goes down the toilet, this technically is still theirs. They may be gone from it for a while, but it still belongs to them. There's a certain security that's of spirit, and to know that this is not forfeit just because there was a bad drought. That this is not something that is going to be forever taken away from you. And that sense of security, social safety net, I think is kind of what you were looking at. Yeah. Apparently, Rambam feels, understanding the Torah and our tradition, was an important principle, not just an important effect, that it was somehow good for people to know that they had this security that, you know what, in 50 years, everything will be reset. And even if I'm not here, it'll be reset and it'll go to my kids. And even if I don't have kids, it'll be reset and go to my family. That I haven't lost this. And that sense of loss aversion is a very real psychological stress for most people. Most people are more worried about what they lose than they're worried about what they don't gain. If you do psychological experiments and you ask someone, how bad you feel that if you spun the die or the wheel and you didn't win $5, most people don't mind not winning $5. But on the other hand, if you spin the wheel and the person loses $5, most people will be very upset that they lost money. And this seems to be giving a person a certain bedrock. You can't lose this. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to come back and maybe challenge that, or maybe at least turn that on its side. But just hold on to that idea from Rambam, the rationalist. Sefer HaChinuch also tries to analyze these commandments.
That we not sell a field in the land of Israel in perpetuity.
Right. That's his usual way, is to restate the mitzvah before analyzing it. So that's, if you remember, that's our verse 23 from this chapter.
That we not sell a field in the land of Israel in perpetuity, as it is stated in Leviticus, but the land shall not be sold in perpetuity. That is, the buyer and seller should not stipulate between them that their sale be in perpetuity. And even though the Jubilee will void it against their will, as it is impossible for them to stipulate about this, since it is against the commandment of Torah. Nonetheless, if they did it, they have violated the negative commandment.
Okay, so this is a very roundabout way of forcing us to ask a question, which is, if God says that if you make a deal, it's no deal, did you actually do anything wrong by making that deal? Right? If I say, I'm going to sell you this for 1,000 years, or I'm going to sell it to you forever, and you say, great, I'm going to buy it from you forever, as far as God's concerned, you've said nothing. Right? Because when the Jubilee comes around, I erased my 49, when the Jubilee comes around, that deal that you made is torn up and dissolved. So did you actually do anything wrong? Right? If the Jubilee still works, it's not like you've actually subverted God's will. You've just simply made a nothing statement. And what he's saying is, no, you did something wrong. To even make the claim that you are selling it forever is in and of itself a negative violation of the negative commandment of don't sell it forever. Even though you can't sell it forever, even though the sale itself is impossible to be forever, you shouldn't even pretend like you're doing it forever. Making sense?
It's an unenforceable contract. If you're trying to
Correct. Exactly.
enforce it, they say, what is this?
But
Why
this
is it here?
unenforceable contract is also illegal.
Right.
And that's what he's trying to draw our attention to. It's not just that I made a statement for selling the moon. I actually committed a crime by making this unenforceable contract. Good. So now he's going to point out that's just Rambam's opinion.
That is the opinion of Rambam. May his memory be blessed. But Ramban,
Also known as Nachmanides,
Ramban, may his memory be blessed, wrote that the words of the master about this are like the matter that is mentioned in Teruma 4, where Rava,
4b, it's a page of the Talmud.
Where Rava, differing with Abaye, said, as anything that the Torah said not to do, if he did it, it is ineffective and he is lashed, as he has violated an edict of the king.
Right? So even though you didn't do anything, you did something. You may not have actually made something happen because it's impossible for what you say to occur because it's going to be released, but you still violated the edict of the king, and therefore you would still be lashed for violating God's law of not selling it.
But he, may his memory be blessed, explained it in a different manner, that it warns or prohibits us not to put the land in the hand of the Gentiles in perpetuity, meaning that we not sell it to them in perpetuity. He explained the verse like this: you shall not sell it to one who will hold it forever, and that is a Gentile. But an Israelite will return it. And if he stipulated with the Gentile to return it, it is permitted to sell it to him.
Okay, so close reading, typical Talmudic fashion, which is to say, it doesn't say don't sell it in perpetuity, meaning that don't make contracts that are meaningless. It means don't sell it in perpetuity, And since the only way you could sell it in perpetuity would be to sell it to a non-Jew who is not bound to the laws of Torah,
Right.
what that actually means is don't sell the land to someone who isn't Jewish, because if you do, it ain't coming back.
Unless he says with the stipulation of return.
Yeah, unless you actually add that as part of your contract.
Right.
Right? But that's not, that's that's just saying, yeah, of course you can sell it to a non-Jew as long as it's agreed upon. But if you don't agree upon selling it, you can't sit there going, I'm going to sell it to him in year 48, and I'm going to get maximum profit off of it. And then come year 49, I'm going to walk back up and say, it's mine again. That's not the way it works, right? Because the non-Jews are not going to return it because they're not bound by the laws of the Torah. And if there was no stipulation, then it is now gone. It has been sold in perpetuity. And that would be a violation of this. So they're arguing that, say, it's not that if you make a nonsense contract with another Jewish person that you still get flogged. It's saying, no, if you make a real contract, you actually sold it in perpetuity, then you would be flogged. But the only way to sell it in perpetuity would be to sell it to someone who is not bound by Jewish law. Make sense?
So what happens if they sold it to, it just stayed with the Gentile forever?
Yeah, it's their property now, right? Because they're not bound by the laws of release.
Yeah, I thought the laws was bound to the land, but not the person.
Well, that's why you don't sell it to them, because they're not bound to the land. They don't have the same obligation to the land that we do, and therefore they're not governed by the same legislation that we are. In many cases, yes, but not in this. And by the way, that's also why it's an argument between Ramban and Rambam, because they both differ on how this verse should be interpreted. But that is Ramban Nachmanides' explanation.
Because didn't it say that this is the land that I am to give you for all times, or no?
Yes?
So if you
Yep.
if you're able to sell it, then it would be yours for all times.
Well, no, it is yours.
Right.
Don't sell it.
Right.
Right? If I give you my favorite gold watch and I say, this is yours now forever, right? And you go to the pawn shop and you sell it, that doesn't mean you can walk back into the pawn shop next week and say, oh, but my rabbi said that the gold watch was mine forever, so I'm going to need that back. And they're going to say, tough, you sold it.
Right, but I thought forever meant for all generations. So if it was to be yours,
Yeah, how do you expect to get it back?
I actually thought,
You thought God was going to come back and say, oh, I know that my son sold the land, but really I need you to give it back to him
no,
now.
I thought the courts would enforce it. Of course.
If the courts, do
Huh?
you think the courts have authority over the non-Jews?
If they're living in Israel, I thought they did.
It depends on the structure. And for most of our history, we did not have authority over non-Jews living in the land of Israel. Yeah, you take a Roman to the Jewish court, see how well that works. Take someone from the Byzantine Empire into the court, see how well that works. Take someone from the Persian Empire, from the Greek Empire, from the Arab Empire.
Those people had superior jurisdiction, though, and once they lost their jurisdiction.
And that's been the case since the end of the Hashmonean period, right? For most of the last 2,000 years. We have lived in Israel longer under someone else's jurisdiction than our own.
Right.
And even when we lived under our own, usually we weren't following Torah. So the actual number of years that Torah has been faithfully observed by the people of Israel in the land of Israel is a minuscule portion of our history, which is a great shame to us and hopefully something that we can rebalance in the future. Okay, but we need to move on because otherwise the future is going to catch up to us and we won't be done reading this.
Leads me to, is that right?
Yes, so that's our wonderful word. If you go back into verse 23, which is being translated in the JPS translation as beyond redemption, but has also been translated in our other commentaries as in perpetuity or forever in some commentaries. How does Fox give it, since you've got that open?
Verse 20.
The land shall not be sold
In harness.
in harness. Okay, so he's like the idea of it being in bondage, meaning chained up forever.
Like to an ox.
Right, that
You
is
found it.
bound for all time. So this term, litzmitut, is being translated as being in perpetuity. But why this word?
For mine is the land. Do not take it amiss then that I forbid this to you. For strangers and settlers are you. Do not make yourselves foremost. And thus it is written in Chronicles. For we are strangers with you and sojourners, as all of our fathers. And thus did David say in Psalms, For a stranger am I with you, a sojourner, as all of my fathers. Are you with me?
Okay, well, we're going to come to "Are you with me" in just a second. So let's analyze what the Sifra is doing here in very tight midrashic fashion. Is reading each word or phrase and interpreting it as part of a longer dialogue or conversation. So this litzmitut, this in perpetuity, that means in perpetuity. All right, so don't sell the land in perpetuity. But then the next question you're going to have is, why not? The answer, for mine is the land, meaning God owns the land, and therefore God gets to say with it. But then we hear a retort, at least implied, that the average person would say, well, wait a minute, I thought you gave it to me. Right? If I give you something, you can't tell me what to do with it. You can't take it away from me. That's not fair. But don't take it amiss then when I forbid this to you, because it is my land. And all the more so, you were strangers, for strangers and settlers are you. You guys are strangers here, meaning to the land of Israel. Right? Remember, no matter how you slice the narrative, at some point, we were back in Ur. Right? At some point, we were way back in what is modern-day Iraq. No matter where you want to think to start the narrative, at some point it begins with this guy called Abraham, which means the guy who was taken from a land that wasn't his, that wasn't from his fathers, that wasn't the land of his birth, that he didn't know, and went to this land. The only reason he has it is because God has called him here, and that means that he is inherently a stranger or sojourner to this land, a temporary resident. And therefore, you shouldn't be that surprised. And don't make yourself foremost. In other words, don't think of yourself as being the primary reason the land is with you. The reason the land is with you is because God is with you. And that then leads us through this idea. First of all, it gets reinforced that indeed, through Chronicles and through David, we are also sojourners, just like our ancestors were. Don't think that just because we've lived here longer, that somehow we're now the original inhabitants. We should always feel that we are this temporary resident dependent upon the one that has made us resident here, which is God. Because, and this final part of verse 23, because you're resident with me. Right? What does it mean with me? Go ahead and keep reading.
It suffices the servant that he emulate his master. When you are mine, it, Eretz Israel, will be yours.
Meaning, if you want access to the land, if you want to have that ownership, then you need to be with me. Because if you're with me, I give you keys to the land. If you're not with me, I take the keys away. Yes, it is yours, but ultimately not yours. And that dualism of it belongs to us, but it can be taken away at a moment's notice, is the great tension that we have in relationship to the land of Israel. Of thinking we have security, because, hey, every 49 years it comes back to the original owner, blah, 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 but also being told the only reason it goes back to the original owner and gives you that sense of security is because God has first claim to the land and therefore can restore it to the original owner. That means your ultimate security of, yes, I know I've already got this social safety net, blah, 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 is ultimately dependent upon God being willing to extend that safety net to you. And if God chooses not to, because you've chosen not to be with God, all bets are off. So are we secure or are we not secure in the land?
If we keep God's word.
We're secure conditionally, which was the whole feeling we were trying to get away from. Right? Rambam was trying to tell us this is giving us compassion, well-being, productivity, kindness, and giving us a sense of security because we have this dependable understanding that our relationship with the land is permanent. And now we've just said, but the relationship with the land is not permanent. It's not permanent because of other human actors. It's not permanent because of our relationship with God, which in itself can change. You're following that logic?
Yeah.
Right? So our lack of security now isn't because we don't trust our neighbors, it's because we don't trust ourselves and God.
Like, all the time they're talking about the original owner. That's God.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of every piece of earth.
Of earth, yeah.
Exactly. That's one of the advantages of being the creator, is you own everything you make. Right. So the idea that there is some original owner, right? It's not even like the people who were there before Abraham showed up were the original owners. They were no more original than Abraham. They too came from somewhere else. And even the first person who, came out of the trees came from the trees. And even the first monkey that went up in the trees came from the ground. And all the way back to the soup of the ocean. right? There is no such thing as the first original owner of any square of dirt.
The Arabs, and Israel, the Palestinians,
Mhm.
they try to use this law to say, oh, the land is ours.
Because there is a feeling that maybe we were alienated. And
Yeah.
indeed, if they were God, they would have the right to say that. But they're not God. And therefore, they don't get to tell us what God has decided to do with us. And in fact, the rest of the Tanakh points out that as much as God has at different times tilted the land up and shaken us out, God has never broken his promise to return us to the land and to have us be there. So if they're going to condemn us by our text, then you also have to reward us by our text. Where our text says that, yes, we can lose our rights, our text also says those rights will never be lost permanently. So if you're going to use our book to try and prove anything, you've got to use the whole book.
Is this philosophy of land that, in a sense, we're just occupying it,
Right.
similar to Native American concept that tribes had hunting areas or different things, but they didn't understand the European
So
who could
there-
own the land.
So there are so many different Native American cultural traditions that I don't think we can say that it is similar to Native American ideas. But are there some places around the world where the idea of property not being held permanently by any individual? Yes, but the Torah has no problem with the idea of individual property ownership and the idea of individual property development and of having the rights to develop the property the way you want to develop it, not as is good for the tribe. We have no problem with that as long as they fall within the general guidelines of Jewish law. So it's not a one-to-one compared to some of the Native American theories of land ownership, which was in many cases more communal. But there were some more private ownership ideas within Native American communities as well. So we can't paint too broad a brush for the other culture. Not my specialty, and I'm sure they would appreciate each nation having their own culture represented, which would be a few hundred. So we're going to move on. Duties of the heart. Now we're going to try and see how we are going to take this idea of the ownership of the land, of security, and apply it in a post-biblical setting.
To be prepared for the journey and for moving on, and to not become comfortable and settled in.
Right. So this is one of the emotions a person should develop within themselves. Right. To meditate on how can I be better connected to God and better balanced in the world. I should dwell on this idea that I should be ready, be prepared for moving, prepared for moving on. I should never be too comfortable in any place that I am. And what is his proof text for this idea?
The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me.
Right, so he takes it, and he takes the verse that we had been saying was a promise of security, and he flips it on its head by saying, yes, but the promise of security is contingent upon God continually allowing us to be there. And therefore, what God is really telling us is that you should learn to be secure in insecurity. Right? You should learn to feel okay and balanced and stable and connected and close to God, even knowing that tomorrow someone may come and say, leave. Right? Or there may be some problem that'll force you to leave, or your house may be destroyed by a hurricane, or that anything could happen. You should be prepared to move on because ultimately you don't really own it. And you should be ready to let go of everything you think is your permanent, secure, settled life.
The emphasis is on the sojourner.
Exactly. You're just a sojourner because you can't own it. Right? There's nothing in your life that you can truly own except what you can carry in your own heart. Everything else is just temporary. And it's good temporary. Nothing wrong with having a house. Right? It doesn't mean you have to go live in a tent or a cave or something. But it does mean that if you're living in a house, you shouldn't think, this is my life because of these walls. You should always be able to wake up in the morning and say, if I had to leave this all behind, I'd still be okay. And I'd still be connected to God. I don't want to leave it. That's okay. But if I were, it would not destroy me. Make sense? All right. If it doesn't make sense, don't worry. We're going to build on this idea more.
A man is necessarily in either one of two situations. Either he is a stranger or he is among his family and relatives.
Right? Those are your two statuses in life. Right? You are either among people you don't know and have no family or friend network around you, or you do have a family and friend network around you. Let's analyze both of these.
If he is a stranger, let his companionship be with God during his time of loneliness, and trust in him during his period of being a stranger.
Right? Because you're never really alone if you recognize that you are with God, and that can help you through this.
And let him contemplate that the soul is also a stranger in this world, and that all people are like strangers here, as the verse says, because you are strangers and temporary residents with me.
All right, so what does he do? He pushes this interpretation into further metaphor, which is to say, you're not just a sojourner. You're not just a temporary resident in your patch of earth. You're a temporary resident on earth. Right? Your life is a blip in your total existence. And this, dance that we do in the material world is going to be over in the blink of an eye. And whether you're among strangers or not, just realize you're still with God, and that is your ultimate permanent state. This current situation is just temporary.
And let him reflect in his heart that all those who have relatives here in a short time will be left a solitary stranger. Neither relative nor son will be able to help him, and none of them will be with him. And afterwards, let him consider that as a stranger, he is freed from the heavy burden of maintaining relatives and fulfilling his duties towards them. He should consider this to be one of the kindnesses of the Creator towards him. Because if he needed to pursue a livelihood for providing his material needs, his exertion would be lighter without a wife and children. And their absence is peace of mind for him, and it is good.
Right. So you think you're sad because you don't have a family around you? If you had a family around you, you'd have more obligations. Right? You'd be forced to do more things to live up to your filial duties if you were living among your family and friends. Therefore, yes, maybe you're not happy about being alone and distant from all of them, but look on the bright side. You don't have to go to the birthday parties. You don't have to go to the weddings. You don't have to worry about buying them food. You don't have to worry about providing more place for them to live. It's not all bad. It's an interesting twist on feeling like, I really miss my family. It's like, yeah, you miss them, but there's some upside, which is a good reflection. If you're forced to be in that situation, I should point out he does encourage that people should be with their family and friends. But if you're not, don't sink into despair. There is a little bit of a silver lining here.
And if he is concerned about his interests in the next world, his mind will undoubtedly be clearer and freer when he is alone.
Right. So it is hard to focus entirely on the transcendental nature of our existence beyond this world when you're changing a diaper, or when you're worried about the mortgage, or when you're fixing the sprinklers. Right? That drags you back to this world in a way that the person who lives by themselves in a modest and alone existence doesn't get. Now, the person who lives in a modest and solitary existence also doesn't have the same opportunity for spiritual growth by encountering and working with other people. But what he's trying to do is give a little comfort to somebody who is in the isolated situation. Again, he's not holding this up as being the ideal, but trying to help people feel comfort if they happen to be in it. Onward.
If the one who trusts in God has a wife, relatives, friends, enemies, let him trust in God to be saved from them.
Now, notice that enemies, friends, relatives, wife are all in the same category that I'm being saved from. Right? God saved me from my friends.
So there is that proverb about a contentious wife.
Right. So he should.
He should strive to fulfill his duties to them, to do their wishes, to be wholehearted with them. He should refrain from causing any harm to them, try to promote what is good for them. He should deal faithfully towards them in all matters, and teach them the ways that will be beneficial for them in their religious matters and the secular ways in the service of the Creator, as written in Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and do not hate your brother in your heart.
All right, so what he tries to say is, yes, you have obligations when you're with other people, both to the good people and the not so good people. Embrace those obligations, right? Do it with a full heart. Do it with kindness towards them. Do it with an understanding of what my obligation is to them, and fulfill that. Right? That doesn't mean you have to, let the enemies walk over you. Judaism doesn't do the whole turn the cheek thing, but it does mean that you do have to still love a person, even as you hold back whatever negative thing they may be trying to cause. And that is an important consideration when you are going through the difficulty of being surrounded by other people and their needs. Right? Right. Onward.
Do not do this out of hope for future benefits from them, or to pay them back for past benefits.
Right. Relationships should not be transactional. Right? Relationships are not meant to be just about reciprocity. This is one of the great myths of the modern world, where a lot of people think, I'm going to be nice to him so that he'll be nice to me. And I'm going to help him move to his apartment, and that way he'll help me move to my apartment. I'm going to put up going to his kid's dance recital, and he'll help me get a job. Right? That is not what it means to help and to live with someone else and to be in the world with them wholeheartedly. That is treating them as though they are just another object to be manipulated and hit the payoff. But rather,
nor should you do this out of love of being honored or praised by them, or out of desire to rule over them.
Right? You shouldn't also be so helpful for other people just so that they'll say, oh, you're such a great person. Not the right motivation. Or just to have the pleasure of being in a position to lord it over them that you were able to do this.
But rather with the sole motive to fulfill the commandment of the Creator and to guard his covenant and precepts over them.
Right? That's ultimately why we should be interacting with other people, which is a remarkably powerful antidote for not mistreating somebody who is mistreating you. Right? When you see, I'm not being nice to this person because they deserve it. I'm not being nice to this person because I think they're going to pay me back. I'm not being nice to this person so that they'll praise me or so that I can lord it over them that I did something. I'm going to be nice to this person even though they don't deserve it, even though they'll never pay me back, even though I never get any praise, honor, or credit for it, because it's what God asked me to do. That's what God asked me to do. And if this person was a different person, I would do it too, because that's just what God has asked me to do. It's part of my relationship with God, is putting up with the bozos as well as the saints, and to do so in the way that God has asked me to do, right? To love my neighbor as myself, to not hate them in my heart. I'm not doing this because they've earned it. I'm doing it because God simply asked me to do so.
Further on in this verse, in verse 35, is the Scots translation is now when your brother sinks down to poverty and his hand falters beside you, then you are to strengthen him.
Yes.
This is that security.
Well, it's not just the security, but it's also the kindness, right?
Right.
And the compassion and seeking the well-being of each other and the long-term productivity of everything.
Right.
It's all bound together. Not just because we recognize these as being rationally objective good goals, but because that's simply what God has asked us to do. And even if we don't understand why these are good, and trust me, there are people in the world who don't get why this is good, who don't intuitively understand that kindness is better than cruelty, the mitzvah is there to prevent them from going down the path of cruelty. Because they'll say, well, I would really like to, be mean to this guy, but God told me not to. So for God's sake, I won't.
This also takes away some of the shame of the poverty or the shame of having had a bad luck or a bad marriage, because you don't have to feel bad about then this rebalancing of things that's going to happen every generation and a half.
True, although we shouldn't underestimate the amount of shame a person can feel of being put into these kinds of difficult circumstances. But indeed, the Torah is there to mitigate that feeling of recrimination or of permanence of loss. And that idea that there could ever be a permanent imbalance in the institutions of society, which trap people at the wrong end of life's pleasures and the joys that should come from living a decent life, that is a real fear. And any society that allows there to be that tipping where if you fall off the ramp into the bucket below, you can never get back up, that should concern anyone when trying to understand society.
There's a lack of hope. So this has hope written all over it in many ways.
Correct. And more than just lack of hope, it's a lack of fairness. And it's also a perversion to the idea that the only way you can conceive of allowing people to slide off the ramp of society into the bucket of nothingness is if you think they deserve it and you deserve to stand where you stand because you've got yours and it's all yours. But as soon as you recognize what I've got ain't mine, it's God's, I just happen to be using it right now, then you can't reasonably look down your nose at people who are sliding down the socioeconomic ladder. You have to instead say, okay, I may have a share that God's given me, but I need to help pull them back up so that they are able to enjoy this world too. Because they deserve it just like I deserve it. And which is to say, none of us deserve it. God has just given it to us.
Thinking about the sayings of the fathers, what's mine is mine, what yours is yours. But what isn't in there, what's mine is God's.
Right. Well, actually, but from Behar vote, the quote goes on to say that the person who says what mine is mine and what yours is yours is actually an evil person. It's supposed to be what's mine is mine and what's mine is yours. That's the proper attitude. Right. And the only way you can say that is because you recognize that what's mine ain't really mine.
What's mine isn't mine, what's mine is God's.
Right. And therefore, I have the obligation to use it as God told me to do, which includes helping you. Which we're going to sort of bring together in one last Musar lesson.
The moral lesson is that just as strangers must not take for granted their right to live in their host country, so Jews must not take for granted their entitlement to the Holy Land, not even after they have settled there.
All right, so Aaron, you brought up this point earlier on, and we're finishing with this topic, which is, but God gave it to us, right? We're done. Right? End of history. God brought us into the land of Israel and we're settled there. Nothing can alter that. And God is trying to point out, actually, yeah, the fact that you have this as your inheritance, yes, is always there. That you have access to your inheritance, that is contingent. Right? No one can touch the trust fund, but whether you can use the trust fund is absolutely up to the administrator of the trust fund, in which, in this case, God. And so we shouldn't look at the land of Israel as being our inalienable right to use however we see fit. We should see the land of Israel as being our inalienable treasure that we may sometimes be privileged to live in and to use as God has seen fit. And when we do so, we'll extend the length of our time on that land. But we should never get so arrogant to think that it's ours and nothing can ever change that. We may not be able to change who should be on that land, but we can actually change whether or not we are on that land, as the last 3,000 years of Jewish history have unfortunately shown us. So with that in mind, we remind ourselves that nothing is truly permanent, and sometimes that should bring us great relief and great release of the burden of stress of trying to make things like they are. But that also means that things that are important to us, we have to be constantly working to maintain, whether they be our relationships with each other, our relationship with God, or our relationship with the land of Israel. Take care.
And the air conditioner.
The air conditioner is still working, And for that, I say thank God.
Is there a misfit tonight?
Yes.